Beautiful. So we
right.
can start.
All right. Welcome back to the Open Peace Podcast, everybody. I'm Jared. I'm joined with Kane, Aboud, and Amir, and a special guest, Gershon Baskin.
Very special.
Like, this dude helped get Gilad Shalit out of Gaza. Like, this dude's important, basically, is what I'm trying to tell y'all watching right now. And just so many questions. Now,
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to start off with some personal questions because I don't know. I tried finding some information. I couldn't find anything about where you were born.
Really? I'm on Wikipedia. You can find my Wikipedia page. If you Google it, you'll get thousands of hits.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at your Wikipedia page, but your Wikipedia page just said you immigrated, so I just kind of assumed like maybe American.
No, I think you looked in the wrong area.
I was born in New York. Grew up in New York.
Yeah.
He immigrated to Israel at the age of 22, 42 years ago.
Damn. Yeah, so you're an OG. Also, where in New York?
Well, I
was born in Brooklyn, but grew up on Long Island in Belmore and Smithtown.
Because my grandfather's from Yonkers and my grandmother's from Queens, so I just wanted to.
I lived in Queens for a year before. The year before I immigrated, I lived in Queens in Regal Park. I was finishing my BA at New York University and living with a bunch of friends from Young Judea, from a Zionist youth movement.
Oh, Young Judea. You know, I actually went. I had a trip to Israel with Young Judea back when I was in high school.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a cool organization.
And what was the reason that you actually made Aliyah?
Yeah.
Well,
that your parents made.
I grew up at I'm a child of the end of the 1960s, I guess one could say. That's when I came of age. And after my family moved from Belmore to Smithtown, Belmore was a very Jewish town, a lot of Jewish kids in my school, and we moved to Smithtown where there weren't very many Jewish kids, and I got involved in a Zionist youth movement, mainly because I thought it'd be a good place to meet Jewish girls. But I got really involved in the Zionist youth movement, and it was a time the civil rights movement in America and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And one of the things that we did in the Zionist youth movement was to not only make Israel attractive in the eyes of the people involved in the movement, but there was also, I think, a pretty steady and thoughtful process of creating a kind of alienation from American society, which at that time wasn't very difficult because America was a bad time, Vietnam War, civil rights movement, probably not as bad as the Trump years, but it was bad in my time. And Israel seemed like a more innocent place at that time. And I came to Israel the first time when I was 13. I came back when I was 15, 16, 17. And each time I came here, I felt that I was home. That was the sense that I had. This was where I belonged. This is where I needed to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's fantastic. And so you mentioned that you came to Israel and the years when you came were not so good in America, and the Trump years as well you mentioned. So actually what I was wondering is, where do you see the peace process in the Middle East in general going now that Trump's no longer involved? Do you think Biden's going to commit to it as much?
Yeah.
Well, we don't currently have leaders in Israel nor in Palestine that are able to engage in a negotiated peace process. And there's never going to be a Pax Americana here. There's no one who can impose peace on the Israelis and the Palestinians until these two people come to terms with each other and are ready to sit down together and negotiate a deal. There's no peace process. There haven't been negotiations for years. And the more time we go without any negotiations, the fewer options there are for negotiating what could be perceived as a fair deal, even though there's no such thing as a fair deal, really. But today we're at a loss for finding a solution that would be acceptable to a majority of Israelis and Palestinians. And it certainly wouldn't be an equitable deal. And America has never been a good negotiator of this conflict. They've always been biased and partial toward the Israeli side, and they've defended the Israeli position when it is essentially necessary to have American pressure on Israel to make the kind of concessions that Palestinians can accept as a minimum. America never really did that. I've always been in favor of Israeli-Palestinian direct negotiations without a third party in the room, certainly not the Americans. I think we need the Americans when we get near to the end of a peace process of a negotiating to help with bridging ideas, to provide the kind of guarantees, both defensive guarantees, security guarantees, and also the ability to raise the international funds that will be necessary to sustain peace. But really it has to come from the Israeli and Palestinian people and from our leaders, which we totally lack at this time.
Right. I think that one thing I really respect, you served in something called the Israeli Ministry of Education. Like, you worked as a coordinator for the education of coexistence, and I think that's a really, really important step for peace, like in coexistence. What can you tell us about that exactly?
Well, that was a position that I actually created when I immigrated to Israel. I had actually gone into a program called Interns for Peace, which was started by a Reform rabbi from the United States, Rabbi Bruce Cohen, who passed away a number of years ago from cancer. But Bruce's idea was to bring American Jewish volunteers to do community work in Arab villages. I went to live in an Arab village in Israel, a Palestinian village in Israel, for 2 years, where I engaged in community work and tried to build programs of interaction with nearby Jewish communities. One of the things that I learned over the 2 years of doing the volunteer work was that the Israeli government wasn't really doing anything proactively to try and build bridges between the Jewish and Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. And at that time, Menachem Begin was the prime minister from the right wing, but Begin spoke all the time about democracy. So I actually wrote Begin a letter saying, what is your government doing actually to bring these two citizen groups of this country together to create equality and democracy? And I proposed that they create a position, that they begin to start to employ civil servants who would be engaged in proactively building bridges. And after about a year, my proposal was accepted, and I became the first civil servant in Israel responsible for building Jewish-Arab relations. And through that, I created an Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence, which was based in the Ministry of Education in the Prime Minister's office. We had funding from the German government. And I actually did that for about 7 years until the outbreak of the First Intifada in the end of 1987, when I understood that new opportunities were developing to build bridges between Israelis and Palestinians, which is what I always wanted to do. See, we have a problem. We have about 21% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian Arabs. But until we resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the 21% of Israeli Arab citizens of Israel will always be suspect. They'll always be second-class citizens because they're thought to be loyal not only to the state, if they're loyal to the state, but they're first and foremost loyal to their own people who are living under Israeli occupation, and the conflict exists between Israel and the Palestinians. So even though they're citizens of Israel, anyway, when the First Intifada broke out, I understood that the Palestinians had come to terms at a national level with the idea of recognizing Israel's right to exist, or at least recognizing that Israel existed, and began talking about a two-state solution, which was certified in November of 1988 when Yasser Arafat declared independence, and the PLO accepted the two-state solution formula as the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And at that time, I left the work that I was doing inside of Israel and created IPCRI, the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, which is a joint Israeli-Palestinian public policy think tank that was dedicated to figuring out how to make a two-state solution work. And I went ahead and co-directed IPCRI for the next 24 years after that, until the end of 2011, when I stepped down in turned it over to the next generation of Israelis and Palestinians to try and figure it out.
Sure.
I mean, I wanted to bring that up, so I'm kind of glad like you brought that up already, because I wanted to ask you about IPCRI. Like, what was the motivations behind it, and how do you feel it's been going since you stepped down from, a position of control?
Well, when I started it, which was in March of 1988, the idea was that we Israelis and Palestinians had to sit down together in the same room, in the same office, in the same institution, and we had to begin to figure out how to resolve the conflict, where we knew that the 7 core issues in conflict were the creation of a Palestinian state next to Israel and the nature of its sovereignty, the delineation of borders between the 2 states, the future of Jerusalem, the question of Palestinian refugees and their rights, the physical link between 2 Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza, with Israel in between, the issue of economic relations, where one side is relatively rich and the other side is very poor, and the 7th issue being natural resources, mainly water. We share the water reserves, and we have to figure out how to do that equitably in a way that will generate cooperation. I would add to that an 8th issue, and that's the nature of security. How do we create security for the peoples living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, for whatever solution we have? And what I knew back in 1988 was that in order to get Israelis and Palestinians, serious Israelis and Palestinians, not from the margins, but from the mainstream, from the establishments, to sit together in the room, we had to say, 1, we're doing this together jointly on an equal basis, and 2, we're not arguing about the solution. The solution that we put down was a 2-state solution, and now we would engage in what's sometimes called reverse engineering. We know where we want to get to, now let's figure out how to get to. And back in 1989, we created 3 joint working groups, an economic working group, a water working group, and a Jerusalem working group, and that work expanded over 24 years. We ran, and I co-facilitated more than 2,000 working groups of Israelis and Palestinians from the very heart of Israeli and Palestinian society, dealing with every single issue in a possible state solution. We knew what we were doing, and if there was still a viable 2-state solution, we know how to do it. There are really no questions. The problem is that Rabin was assassinated at the beginning of the process. Netanyahu came in. The Palestinians and the Israelis breached every agreement they signed. Israel and the PLO signed 6 agreements. They systemically breached all 6 agreements. And there's a magical thing that happens when you negotiate with someone. If you reach an agreement and then you don't implement the agreement, or both sides don't implement the agreement, you ask yourself, why should we even sit down and negotiate? Because we know that the other side has no intention of implementing the agreement. And that's where we got to in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, is that each side went into the room to continue to negotiate with the sense that there was no goodwill and no real intention to implement what they were doing, and negotiations became impossible, and the violence broke out in the Second Intifada, which destroyed the peace process, destroyed the peace camp in Israel, and destroyed the Palestinian Authority at the time, which has taken years to rebuild. But now there's so many facts on the ground that make a 2-state solution perhaps no longer viable.
Mm-hmm. And that was my next question for you, Gershon. As of today, 2021, the 2-state solution looks further than anything than happening. So do we need to start thinking outside the box about different solutions that can work on the ground for Israelis and Palestinians together? Because it's my feeling that as well, that the 2-state solution and the Oslo Accords and splitting the West Bank into A, B, C it wasn't the smartest idea. Taking a small area, considering the West Bank isn't that big, and splitting it in 3 different areas, that was never going to work. So is there a solution that we could look at that grants human rights to both Israelis and Palestinians, and we live here as equals on the land like we should be? And what would that kind of solution in your eyes look like? And how can we get there? Like through mediating, through negotiation, how can we actually get there?
I think first it's important to realize that the division of the territories into A, B, and C was a temporary move. And the Oslo Agreement was a 5-year agreement. It wasn't supposed to go 25 years. It was supposed to last 5 years. And the main intention of creating this A, B, and C, A, where the Palestinian Authority had full authority, B, where the Palestinian Authority had civil control and Israel retained security control, and C, the area where Israel retained full control, was only supposed to be for a temporary period of a maximum of 5 years. And the main reason why that was done was because Palestinians first had to create governance, which they didn't have before. They had non-governmental organizations that were very politicized, and they needed to create a central governing authority and to begin to govern. So Area A was over the Palestinian cities, where the largest concentration of Palestinians were living. B were the Palestinian villages, where you had Palestinian Authority control over the civilian population, but Israel retained security control. And C is the area where all the Israeli settlements were. And there was no trust to enable the Palestinians to have security control over them. But even according to the Oslo agreements, Israel was supposed to withdraw from more than 90% of the West Bank before we even began negotiating permanent status. That was one of the main Israeli breaches, is that they stopped withdrawing from territory and turning it over to the Palestinians and continued to build settlements there. So I think that it's important to recognize that this wasn't a long-term scheme that we're dividing and piecemealing the territory. It was essentially supposed to go all over to the Palestinians. The Oslo Agreement stipulated that Israel would retain control over specified military locations, which was around 1% of the West Bank, and areas that dealt with permanent status, which were the Israeli settlements, which if you took the Israelis, what the Palestinians did is they got aerial photographs and they measured 50 meters from the furthest house in every settlement and drew a ring around it and calculated that the total footprint of the physical footprint of the settlements was 2%. So essentially Israel was supposed to have withdrawn from 97% of the West Bank before Camp David in July of 2000, when they began dealing with permanent status. That, of course, didn't happen.
2% instead?
Area C today is 62% of the West Bank, and that's where Israel maintains full control. And if you ask the average Israeli on the street, what is Area C? Israelis will tell you that's the area that Israel has sovereignty over. Israel has no sovereignty over any part of the Palestinian territories, not even over East Jerusalem that was annexed by Israel. That is not recognized as legal sovereignty in international law. Only by Israel is it recognized as legal sovereignty, maybe another couple of countries. But anyway, if we want to find a solution, we have to also go back to what it is that we're fighting over. I used to say all the time that for more than 100 years, Jews and Arabs have been killing each other over what I call a territorial expression of their identity. A territorial expression over their identity over the territory which one side calls Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and the other side calls Palestine, but it's the same exact territory. So the logic of the two-state solution was that we can't really share it, so let's divide it. That's been the logic back in the Peel Commission in 1936-37, the UN resolution on partition in 1947, and the Oslo peace process was about partition. I want to assert that I never supported the idea of complete and total physical separation of what Ehud Barak called in his campaign, us here and them there, and walls and fences that divide us. That will never make a workable solution. It's only through building cooperation across borders that we will have a sustainable peace, regardless of where that border is. If we don't establish cooperation over those borders, we'll never have peace. And the classic example, and one of the biggest problems in finding a solution today, is the city of Jerusalem itself. Jerusalem cannot be physically divided. If you physically divide Jerusalem, you kill Jerusalem. There are 30% of the people living in Jerusalem today who are Palestinians, who don't have rights in Jerusalem. They are not citizens of Israel. They're living in occupied territory. There are parts of East Jerusalem that look like Calcutta in its worst sense, 5 kilometers away from the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. We have areas of Jerusalem which are under Israeli control that live in total poverty. 80% of the Palestinians living in Jerusalem live under the poverty line. That is not a recipe for equality, for sustainability, for peace. So if we're looking for solutions, I suggest that we think about how do we create a solution in Jerusalem and maybe work out from there, whether it be one city governed together by Israelis and Palestinians, or we create separate governances, a municipality for Palestinians, a municipality for Israelis, and have an umbrella municipality. This could be called federation or confederation, and there are different hybrid models out here. We need to consider that no Israeli government will be able to remove more than 500,000 settlers from the West Bank, or 250,000 Israelis who live in East Jerusalem. No way. This is not going to happen.
No,
and we need to recognize also that Palestinians, regardless of where they live, they don't just want to be connected to Nablus and to Tulkarem and to Jenin and to Hebron. They're also connected to Haifa and Ramle and Akko and Lud. This is part of their heritage as well. So we need to find a solution that's going to enable a free flow of movement across borders. We're going to maybe need to find solutions that enable to be residents of one place and citizens of another place. For example, in the European Union, you could be a Polish citizen living in Germany, having all the rights of a German citizen to live and work in Germany, but you vote for the Polish parliament. You retain your citizenship, you have your national identity, but you can live anywhere within this union. Israel-Palestine is a lot smaller unit and a lot easier to do it. Maybe we need to look for solutions that enable that kind of reality. I don't know what the solution is. I think that we have to get back to the drawing board. We need to bring Israelis and Palestinians back into the room together. We got to knock our heads together, and we got to figure out ideas that can work, that need to provide security, that need to provide equality, that need to provide dignity, that need to recognize that there are two peoples living in this land, that all the land is precious to all of us, from the river to the sea. When we Jews read our Torah every week, we're not reading about the beaches of Tel Aviv. We're reading about the hilltops and the valleys of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. That's where the heritage, the story of the Jewish people is, the biblical connection. So we need to figure out a new way of doing this, not the hard division, separation of us here and them there and walls and fences. That's a dead solution. It will never work.
Yeah,
I totally agree with you on that. And you've already basically established the way you feel about the government is that they've been lackluster at times in their approach to making this happen. But what is interesting to me is whether the public, because in Tel Aviv and in the center, the people are very disconnected from this conflict. So do you think that there is actually sufficient motivation within the Israeli public, never mind the government, but the public? Do you feel like they actually care about this coming to an end or changing?
No, they don't. I mean, it's really a tragic kind of situation because when the Palestinians are frustrated and they use violence, the Israeli response is we don't negotiate with them because they're violent. When they don't use violence, as in the past years, and they're quiet and everything is
don't listen to them.
When we say we don't have to negotiate with them because there's no problem. So it's kind of a trap that we're in, but this problem doesn't go away. And I think that it's only going to come from a leadership position that's going to recognize that there are opportunities to create a new discourse, there are opportunities to renegotiate, but I think it really requires for us to have new leadership. Israel is going to elections in 18 days, I think, from now, in 2.5 weeks from now.
Yeah, it's on the 23rd.
An electoral process in the end of May and then in July. And hopefully some new leadership will come out of those elections. If not, I'm afraid we're going to have to wait either for the next round of violence or from international pressure. Maybe it'll come through the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which is now going to be investigating war crimes conducted by Israel and by Hamas. and maybe that will create some kind of public pressure. Perhaps it will come from yes around the world if there's pressure and boycott in Israel, because Israel is heading into an apartheid situation. We have a bi-national, non-equal reality that exists between the river and the sea, where Israel, which claims is the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, is today, from the river to the sea, neither a Jewish nation state nor is it a democracy. So we are actually lying to ourselves about our reality, and someday that's going to hit us in the face.
Yeah. I understand your point, Gershon, but I would be careful to use the word apartheid in the sense that, you know, within Israel, I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza, there isn't an apartheid, if you're asking me, okay? Israeli Arabs have full rights and they can vote.
No, they don't have full rights. I agree that within Israel it's not apartheid, but there is no equal rights for Israeli Arabs. There's not a single aspect of life in which they are not discriminated against, both systemically and socially within Israeli society. There are tens of laws in Israel that discriminate against them. There's systemic discrimination against Arabs with everything concerning land rights.
If I could interject for a quick second. I said if I could just interject for a quick second. Which of those laws specifically target Israeli Arabs?
The most important laws have to deal with control of land. Arabs cannot purchase land in Israel that's owned by the Keren Kayemit, for an example, the Jewish National Fund.
But isn't that a decision by Kakal rather than the Israeli government?
Kakal is, we're a state which is more than 70 years old. How can you have a non-governmental organization which has responsibility over land in the state of Israel? That's done to keep it for Jews only, which discriminates against Arabs.
No, I agree with you there, Gershon.
72 years of Israel, no new Arab communities have been built except the reservations that have been built for Bedouins in the south. You go to any Arab village, it is bursting at the seams because the population has grown by hundreds of percent and they don't have land to build. They look like pavillas that you see in Brazil. Go to Faradis, a village which is right next to Zichron Yaakov, one of the nicest towns in Israel. Faradis is a huge slum. This is intolerable in a state which calls itself a democracy. 21% of the public don't have access to land, don't have access to budgets. If you look at the budgets of schools, the schools of Arab students in Israel have a much less per student allocation by the government than Jewish schools.
I agree with you there. I agree with you there fully, Gershon, and a lot needs to be done within the Arab communities in Israel to benefit and progress. But I'm from the south. I'm from a little kibbutz opposite Rahat, right? And I remember what Rahat was like 25 years ago, and I know what Rahat is today. Now, of course, there needs to be much more work done there socially and to improve.
Rahat was created to prevent the Bedouins from living on their own land, which the Israeli government refused to recognize the ownership of their land and gathered them together and gave them little plots of land. They were not urban dwellers. They didn't live in semi-urban settlements. They were Bedouin. They were nomads who lived on their land and grazed their goats and grew wheat and other crops. And
I know.
Rahat, Makia, Ksefi, these are towns, reservations that were created to round up the Bedouin to prevent them from claiming ownership over their land. Those are the only Arab communities that have been built in the last 72 years.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say, Gershon, is that there is development and there is like progress over there, right? There's soda stream down there.
There's not equitable progress.
People get educated. People live in the 21st century. People have access to internet. They want to go to universities. The Technion today, 30% of the students in the Technion are Arabs, and a majority of them are young Arab women. That's progress, but that's not progress done by the government of Israel. That's progress from within the Arab communities themselves, who have recognized that their ticket out of poverty is education. Social mobility is based by, and it's not only education. Look at what they're studying today. They're studying engineering and mathematics and computer. 10, 15 years ago, they were studying Arabic language, history, politics, and human rights. But today they're moving into engineering and mathematics and computers.
In the West Bank we're talking about?
No, Israeli.
All right.
In the West Bank as well. Look at the West Bank universities. By the way, all the West Bank universities and 7 universities in Gaza. The West Bank University have a majority of girl students, not boy students, and they're moving much more into engineering and computers and science and mathematics.
Yeah,
that's the road to social mobility.
What's up with there isn't enough kind of innovation going on. Even though they have a lot of engineers, they're a lot of people studying engineering and all other endeavors, but we're not seeing any entrepreneurs there.
Well, there are entrepreneurs, but when you compare it to Israel, it's a completely different story. The startup nation of Israel is based on the fact that a majority of these startups are people who went through technological units in the Israeli army. They got trained for free. They got trained as part of the military service. They continued serving for another few years beyond their 3 years and came out and were picked up by companies and startups that wanted to use the genius that they were taught in the Israeli army. They have a starting point which doesn't compare to anyone who finishes a Palestinian university in engineering. But go to Rawabi, go to even in Gaza. Look at the Gaza Sky Geeks. Is a Gaza-based organization of high techies in Gaza who are now outsourcing on software development of building applications for smartphones and doing other work that can be done where you have absolutely no freedom of movement, doing it within Gaza. And there are several high-tech hubs that have started across the West Bank, connected to universities and connected to other companies. Microsoft has a center. Mellanox, one of the big companies that was recently sold by Israel to some multinational for billions of dollars, employs a couple of hundreds of Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. So it's happening, but it's actually much smaller, much slower. There's a lot less financial resources available to them than there are in Israel. Israel is a leader in startup, in technology. No question about it. But even in Israel, look, out of every 100 startups in Israel, maybe 2 or 3 of them make it. The majority of them don't.
Yeah, 90%, 80% don't make it.
Yeah.
But as a tour guide, I just wanted to ask a question here. As a tour guide, I'm curious. You wrote a book, The Convergence of Dreams, the Development of Tourism in the Middle East. What can
that was a long ago,
Yeah, what can you tell us a little bit about it?
The project that we did, I think even before Oslo, I think in 1991 or 92, we brought together both private sector and government people from the field of tourism from Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. And we had a series of conferences where we brought some tourism experts from abroad, including some from the UK and from the US. And we talked about how do we develop a framework that would enable tourists to come to the region to expand their horizons by visiting not only the Holy Land, but seeing the pyramids, by seeing what Palestine has to offer, by creating a cooperative network, and creating opportunities for that. We wrote that book, The Convergence of Dreams, based on the idea that tourism is a dream, making a dream come true. And it was so long ago, I don't remember what we proposed. I assume that we proposed making border movement easier.
It's a very cool idea because I'm a tour guide in Mount Gerizim, and this area is considered A and C at the same time. So we see Palestinians and Israelis come and hang out, actually. So it's
I've been up there lots of times.
Oh, really?
One of the most beautiful places I've ever seen.
Yeah, we had the privilege of going there to meet, to get all together a couple of weeks ago. It was a breathtaking scene looking down on Mount.
I've been to the museum up there and met the Kohen Gadol.
What's his? Oh, really?
Yeah.
Might be my grandfather if it was in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it was in the last 10 years, definitely. I've been going to Mount Gerizim since the late 70s. I've been going up there. I used to drive a Vespa all around the country. I used to drive up there.
Late 70s. You've been in this game a while.
Living the dream. I think that there's a lot to learn from your wisdom. You You've got such a long history here, Gershon, and it's such a pleasure to have you with us and to learn from you and some of the things that you've done. And I'd like to just get on to another little subject about something that you had a role in, and that's the negotiations with Hamas over Gilad Shalit. Is there anything that you could tell us about the negotiations and how you even managed to get into that position?
Like, what do the notes even look like when you do that? It's like, dear guy who wants to cut off my head, could you please let the dude go? Like how does that work?
Here's the way it works. It was actually a year before Gilad Shalit was abducted. One of my wife's first cousins was kidnapped and murdered by Hamas.
Oh God, sorry. Very sorry to hear that.
When he was abducted and he was missing, the family had approached my wife and asked my wife for me to use my connections with the Palestinians to see if we could find out anything. They knew that he was going to Ramallah after work with one of his workers. He had a factory that made candy, and one of his workers told him about a factory in Ramallah that had gone bust and had machinery for sale. So the family knew that he was supposed to go to Ramallah, and he never came home. I tried to use my contacts, and we couldn't find out anything. And a few days later, they published on a website a videotape of him handcuffed, and he was bleeding. He was tortured. He read out a declaration. He spoke Arabic. He read out a declaration demanding that Israel release Palestinian prisoners in exchange for his life. And a few days later, the Israeli security found his body on the side of a road in the West Bank. He was brutally stabbed to death. At his funeral in Jerusalem, which was attended by more than 1,000 people who didn't know him, I stood over his grave with the family, and I swore to myself that if ever anything like this happened again and I could do something to save a life, I would do everything humanly possible. Several months later, I was attending a conference, a World Bank conference, or Mediterranean Development Conference in Cairo. I was the only Israeli there. And a friend of mine from Gaza, who was an economist, came up to me and said, Gershon, I want you to meet someone. Standing with him was another guy with a beard who looked like a religious Muslim. He said, this is Professor Mohammed Migdad. He's from the Islamic University of Gaza, and he's a member of Hamas. And he came from Gaza to Cairo to this conference because he heard that there might be some Israelis here. He's never spoken to an Israeli before. So I had never spoken to anyone from Hamas before. I had been working with Palestinians for more than 20 years, never met anyone from Hamas. We spent about 6 hours over the next 2 days talking. We didn't agree on almost anything, but we said that the talking was important. And I proposed to him that we try to create a dialogue group, that he would put together a group of people from Hamas in Gaza. I would put together a group of Israelis, serious people. I told him I would find a country outside that would host us. We had to find a country that was not part of the European Union. We didn't want to go to an Arab country. It couldn't be the European Union because Hamas is a terrorist organization by the European Union and they couldn't get visas. I found 4 countries that were willing to host us: Turkey, Norway, Switzerland, and Russia. The Russians were the most forthcoming. So we decided the first meeting would be in Moscow. And the Russians asked me to get the passports, copies of the passports of the Palestinians, so they could prepare visas for them, and began a whole process of delay and not happening. In the end, I went down to Gaza and I met with Mohammed and his colleagues at the Islamic University. And they said that they wouldn't go without a green light from the Hamas leadership. So we got in his car and we drove to the Prime Minister's office, Ismail Haniyeh's office, and there I am with my Israeli ID giving to the guards at the entrance of the Hamas Prime Minister's office. We went to see Dr. Ahmed Youssef, who's an advisor to the Prime Minister, thought to be one of the more moderate people in Hamas. We sat with Dr. Ahmed for about 2 hours, and at the end of the 2 hours, he said, I'll join the group, which was wonderful. An advisor of the Prime Minister going to join the group. I went back to Jerusalem and waited for the copies of the passports, which didn't come. In the end, Hamas leadership put a veto on it. But in the interim, I managed to get Migdad out of Gaza, and we attended together a conference that we had organized in Istanbul, and I got to spend more time with him. In any event, on June 25th, 2006, 8 Palestinian fighters attacked the Israeli army base at Kerem Shalom. They killed 2 Israeli soldiers, and they kidnapped Gilad Shalit. Afterwards, the Israelis started a military operation in Gaza, and they were bombing Gaza, the electricity plant and the water network and roads. And 6 days later, on July 1st, 2006, Professor Migdad called me and said, Gershon, we have to do something. I said to him, what can we do? He said, let's try to open up a line of communication. He went back to the Prime Minister's office. Half an hour later, they called me. The person I spoke to was the spokesperson of the Hamas government and an advisor to Hania, Dr. Razi Hamad. And Razi suggested that we conduct a phone call between one of the Hamas leaders and the father of the soldier. It took me a few hours to find the family's phone number. I contacted them. Put together that phone call. The next day, Noam and Aviva Shalit, Gilad's parents, came to Jerusalem. I met them. And from that moment on, until 5 years and 4 months later, when Gilad came home, I was involved in trying to create a secret direct back channel. After 3 months, I produced the first proof that Gilad was alive with a handwritten letter by him that was delivered to the Egyptians in Gaza. Afterwards, I was pushed away because the Egyptians took over and didn't want anyone else involved. And then it took about another 5 years to convince the Israelis that a secret direct back channel was the way to go. But in April of 2011, a guy from the Mossad was appointed by Netanyahu to be in charge. And I contacted him and said, I have connections. And eventually, after 3 weeks of him getting into the position, contacted me and asked me to send messages to Hamas. I did, got answers within an hour. They understood that they had something serious. David Meidan, the Mossad guy, got permission from Netanyahu to run a secret direct back channel. He didn't tell Netanyahu who it was or what it was. Netanyahu gave a green light as long as it remained secret, which it did. And a few months later, Gilad Shalit came home.
Incredible.
It was that the deal that was made in October of 2011 was the same deal proposed by the Egyptians in December of 2006. It took 5 years to implement a deal that was basically agreed on in 2006.
Yeah, I remember being in high school. We had these posters up all over the place. And what's interesting to me about that is,
for 6 years, we have the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers in Gaza. We have 2 Israeli civilians who are presumed to be alive, Avera Mengistu, an Ethiopian Israeli, and Hisham Asayid, a Bedouin Israeli, who are presumed to be alive. And we have a return of the same situation, that there are no negotiations really taking place. I firmly believe that the only way to resolve this is through a secret direct back channel. Israel is going to have to release Palestinian prisoners. There's no other way. A deal is going to have to be made. It can be a better deal than the Shalit deal because we're not dealing with a live Israeli soldier. But nonetheless, it will involve releasing people that Israel doesn't want to release.
So why do you think the government aren't doing enough to release these 2 Israeli citizens? I think it's a travesty, to be honest with you, Gershon.
Well, they have very little social value. They're both mentally ill. They both went into Gaza on their own, even though the government should have prevented them from getting in. One's an Ethiopian, the other's a Bedouin. There's no campaign to release them. They're not white Ashkenazi Jews who were soldiers who were kidnapped by Hamas. And bodies are considered also low value, even though to the families it's very important. No one wants to release terrorists from prison in exchange for the bodies of soldiers. So it's very difficult to negotiate a deal until, once again, there'll be a leadership decision that it's time to put an end to this saga. I think it's also in the interest of Hamas. The message I've been giving them for the past years is that Israel has agreed to loosen the siege on Gaza, but never implements those decisions because there are 4 Israelis in Gaza. And as long as those Israelis remain in Gaza, Israel's not going to implement the changes which will improve life in Gaza. So Hamas should have an interest, but Hamas doesn't have a real interest in improving the lives of the people in Gaza. And that's part of the problem as well.
Yeah. Do you think Israel should remove Hamas?
Sorry, Jared.
No.
One sec. I just want to ask Gershon about what he was just talking about and Hamas affecting people's lives in Gaza. I know recently there was a million spent on a brand new mosque that went up there. They're calling it the PlayStation 5 mosque. And why is money that goes in there as charity not actually going to people and going on, mosques? You have hundreds of bombed out buildings. You have 40%, 50% unemployment. What can you do?
The money for the mosque was donated, and it was donated from the outside for building a mosque. So it's not like if someone gives you $1 million and say, I want you to build X, and you say, no, I don't want to build X, then you either don't receive the money or you, whatever. During the past 3 wars in Gaza, Israel also destroyed a lot of mosques. Remember, Gaza is a religious place. There are lots of religious people, and there are lots of mosques. And someone donated money to build a mosque, so they used the money to build a mosque. It wasn't like, say, build a hospital or build a mosque, and they decided to build a mosque. It was, here's the money for building a mosque.
Mm-hmm. No, I get that. I get that, Gershon. But how can we as Israelis or the international community as a whole change the reality on the ground there? When you have 40-50% unemployment, when you have high crime rates, high rates of poverty, high rates of illiteracy, how can we tackle these issues that they have there?
Yeah, actually, first of all, the poverty rates are much higher than 40-50%. Unemployment, youth unemployment in Gaza is about 80%. The overall unemployment is above 60%. There is actually very little crime. There's almost no crime at all, except maybe crime committed by the government against the people. But there's actually, it's not like in the Israeli Arab communities where there's a lot of illegal weapons. There are no illegal weapons in Gaza. Hamas completely controls. The only people carrying weapons are people who are authorized to carry weapons in Gaza. It's not like during the years before Hamas came to power when there were civil wars going on. There's actually very little crime. Almost.
Are you sure about that, Gershon? Because isn't there factional wars there with Islamic Jihad and the civil war that happened back in 2005?
The civil war was in 2007.
Yeah.
We're in 2021 now. There's almost no crime there. There's almost no violent crime. There might be, I assume I know that there is a crime against women as women, and there's probably sexual violence amongst families. But we're dealing with a very conservative society, but nonetheless, it is a patriarchal society. And there's very little theft. There's a lot of charity. There's a lot of mutual aid. There have been periods during this very difficult period where there's stories that appear in the social media about shop owners that are wiping out the debts of people because they can't pay it. So they're just wiping them out. And it usually happens around Ramadan. Ramadan is the time when people give charity. So it's very common. But Gaza is not going to break through out of its poverty and situation until it can reconnect with the world. Israel allows goods to go into Gaza, but for every 2,500 trucks of goods that go into Gaza, only 1 truck comes out. And until the Gaza economy is reconnected to the world, reconnected to the West Bank, reconnected to Israel, we're not going to change that. There's a need for workers in Israel, in the kibbutzim and moshavim all around Gaza. There's a need for thousands of workers. There used to be 2 border industrial zones that employed thousands of people from Gaza, and tens of thousands when you look at the circle of employment that was created by having those factories working. Until that happens, again, Gaza is going to remain in poverty. Hamas is changing. Hamas is modifying. Hamas is today of 2021 is not Hamas of 2000 of 1990, 1987, 88 when it was founded. It's a very different movement. They changed their charter, and now recently, according to reports coming out of Palestinian media, they've officially agreed to a political statement to enable them to participate in the upcoming elections, which basically say they support a 2-state solution. I know that the official position is that they are willing to accept a Palestinian state in the territories occupied by Israel in '67, but they're not willing to recognize Israel. I assume that is their position. They recognized in the past the Arab Peace Initiative, which is basically recognizing Israel within the 1967 borders. So Hamas is evolving, and they are different from the Muslim Brotherhood, even though they're a spin-off from the Muslim Brotherhood. They're a Palestinian national movement, which is a religious Islamic movement as well. They removed elements of anti-Semitism from their charter. that were written in the original charter by Ahmed Yassin and his followers. So there is evolution happening there. It's not that they're becoming moderate. It is, though, that they're becoming more pragmatic.
I understand. I get what you're saying about them becoming more pragmatic and stuff. But I happened to see a video 2 days ago released by Hamas TV. And it was actually a cartoon of Israeli settlements being attacked and bombed. Beitar Elite, Ma'ale Adumim. And this is the kind of education that they're putting out there to their kids. So how can we really start to negotiate peace when this is what they're putting out there?
And also, how can we loosen up the border?
It's not the party at the other side of the table that we're trying to negotiate with, but that we should negotiate with. We need to negotiate with the Palestinian leadership, which is officially the PLO. I think that we need to extend a hand to the 2.3 million people who live in Gaza and begin to treat them as neighbors and not as enemies. Hamas is one level, but the 2.3 million people who live in Gaza don't wake up every morning and say, how am I going to kill a Jew? Most of them are saying, how am I going to put food on my table? And if we would be more like neighbors, we could open up bridges to the hearts and minds of people who live there. The education that they get from the reality of their lives is 1,000,000 times more influential than anything they read in a book or a cartoon that they watch.
School education.
Yeah, interestingly enough, we've been told by the few Palestinian guests we've had that they feel that there's been a shift, and now the hatred is stronger in the West Bank of the people towards Israel.
Yeah, than in Gaza.
I don't know how to measure hatred. I can tell you that
of course.
I travel all over the West Bank in my own car. I go there every week. I meet people, and from my point of view, I speak Arabic, and I extend my hand in peace, and I find peace in return. When you treat people with respect, you get respect. When you treat people with peace, you get peace. And I almost never, very rarely do I feel scared or threatened by any situation that I enter into whenever I travel anywhere in the West Bank. And I've been to Nablus, and I go to the refugee camps all over the West Bank. I go everywhere, villages and towns throughout the area. I would go to Gaza tomorrow if the Israelis would allow me. And I would be hosted by people in Gaza, and I would be protected and welcomed in Gaza. So I think it's also part of a mindset. When you go with a sense of hatred and fear, then that is, it's sensed by people, and that's what you get in response. I think there are very few good reasons for Israelis and Palestinians to like each other at a normative level. We sort of celebrate the conflict between us. And the messages that we give each other almost every day is the message that there is no partner for peace on the other side. But when you ask Israelis and Palestinians, do you want peace? The overwhelming majority of both sides say yes, but they also say they don't. I want it, they don't. And you hear that from both Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah, that's crossed wires, though. I think it's being miscommunicated to us massively by our government and their government.
Well, I think that what we see in day-to-day reality gives us the message that there is no partner, whether it be if there's an attack in Israel by a Palestinian and you see on television Palestinians celebrating that attack, or when you see Israelis building more settlements, or you see the violent behavior of settlers, you can understand why they feel the way they do. So on both sides, we don't have message when Abu Mazen goes to the United Nations and makes a speech so filled with hatred. And I know Abu Mazen quite well, and I know that he doesn't hate and he really wants peace. But he's not capable of doing it anymore. He's just not in a position where he can deliver. He doesn't have legitimacy, not only in the Israeli eyes, he doesn't have legitimacy in the eyes of his own people. And we all know that Netanyahu is never sincere, has never been sincere about making peace with the Palestinians.
You might as well just say the sky is blue with that.
Yeah, Abu Mazen one time, he was against, for example, what was almost to cause a third intifada. He said that on live or like in a conference or something. But a lot of people, criticized him for not wanting a third intifada.
Abu Mazen has also said that the security coordination between Israel and the Palestinians is holy, muqaddas. He has said he has been against terrorism, and his security forces fight against terrorism all the time. And all you have to do is ask the Israeli Shin Bet, or the Israeli officers in the army, and they will tell you that the number one defensive line of Israel against terrorism is the Palestinian Authority security forces. Which is not very popular amongst the Palestinian people.
Right.
Now, there's one thing I want to bring up, because we have some friends of ours we've had on the show, and they brought up an idea that I just want to flip by you real quick and get your thoughts on. They had this whole federation system with like this constitution they wrote up with states trying to split up like between Jewish majority states and Palestinian majority states. Like they have this whole plan. It's basically a federation of Israel-Palestine. You can call it, the country has both names, you can call it whichever you want. Like, do you think a plan like that might be where we need to go? If we're going to
I counted 7 different detailed plans that have been written that cross the lines of federation or confederation. There's also what's called 2 states, 1 homeland, which is also known as a land for us all, and you should invite them to your show because they have a very detailed plan also. And I think it's difficult to present a plan to the public and to try and sell it, but I think we need to bring back to the table thinkers and people with influence to come up with some new ideas and concepts and principles before we go into the detailed work of writing a constitution or dividing borders around communities to create states. Or I think that we really need to agree on some basic principles before we detail a plan. The principles are that the whole land is important to all of us, that whatever solution we come up with has to grant people freedom of access and freedom of movement. We have to look at issues of residency and citizenship. We have to deal with security. We need to deal with principles of equality. And we can, from these principles, go into different kinds of plans. There's no model that I would embrace today and say, this is the only way that we can move forward. I think the models are good because they inspire people to think. And I would propose that any group of Israelis and Palestinians to come together, we should put down all the existing models on the table and look at all the ideas that have been out there and try and come up to, we're going to need to develop something that's unique for our situation. And you don't write a constitution overnight. These things take years to develop.
I fully agree.
There's an interesting organization that I've begun to look at. It's called the I think it's called the Initiative for Reducing the Conflict. That are looking at not resolving the conflict, but how do we begin to build bridges again? How do we begin to remove some of the obstacles that create the hatred and make life difficult for each other? And we need to have that process going on. At the same time, my Jerusalem Post column this past week, I have a weekly column in the Jerusalem Post. My column this past week was calling for a reset of relations between Israelis and Palestinians. And I suggested that we begin the reset by Israel actually providing corona vaccines for the Palestinians, which I believe is the moral thing to do. But my argument in the article was that it's the epidemiological thing to do, because the coronavirus doesn't observe a green line or a checkpoint. It moves across that line every day. And Israel will not be safe from coronavirus unless all the Palestinians are also safe from the coronavirus. So if Israel has access to the vaccinations, which it does, Netanyahu claims we have 38 million doses in our warehouses, then rather than giving them out as diplomatic bribery to Guatemala and Honduras and other countries, we should be vaccinating the millions of Palestinians who live with us.
I have a Palestinian barber who told me, I don't know, he said Netanyahu proposed to give the Palestinians, but I don't know, he said the Palestinians said no.
No. That's all part of the spins and the lies. Israel started last week vaccinating the more than 100,000 Palestinians who work in Israel, which really should have been done from the day one, because it's those workers who cross the borders every day who are the biggest spreaders or the biggest dangerous spreaders. And it was actually, there was a piece in the paper on Friday which said that the Israelis have made a decision that they're going to make the vaccinations available to the Palestinians. So I hope that's true. I think it appeared in the Jerusalem Post, and I hope it's a true reflection of a decision that's been made. It is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely,
Yeah.
100% agree.
And Palestinians will not say no to it because Israel's offering it. Palestinians don't want to look like they're on their hands and their knees begging Israel to give us vaccinations.
Of course, yeah.
But if Israel made them available, the Palestinian Authority will gladly take them.
Yeah, I think Israel's been cutting their nose off to spite their face until now, apparently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what country hasn't kind of done that? During this whole thing, especially in this past decade, what country hasn't done that?
And there's a whole nationalism today of vaccinations. And look at what's happening all over Europe. Every country is now acting on their own to get vaccines because the European Union did such a horrible job of getting them. So each country is now working against, and it's essentially a kind of a zero-sum game. The more I get, the other side has.
I agree fully, and Italy just blocked a shipment of vaccines heading to Australia to upset the Brits, which I think is very cheeky on their part, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's Australia, so who cares?
I was wondering, Gershon, as a Samaritan, I have an Israeli and a Palestinian ID. So obviously I have access to all of the Holy Land here. And even Gaza, I don't know about Gaza. But it makes me wonder if you said you were with a two-state solution or something?
In principle, yes, a two-state solution with open borders, and I'm not sure that it's viable. By the way, Aboud, you can run in the upcoming Palestinian elections. There's a place.
I mean, I can run with both. I'm qualified.
Dude, good luck getting elected to anything in Palestine with your face being so connected with ours.
It's reserved for Samaritans in the Palestinian parliament. It has to be filled by a Samaritan.
You're right. We had a Samaritan in the Palestinian parliament.
Right.
Now we don't. And funny enough,
there's no Palestinian parliament. It's been canceled for years.
Right. Right. All right. Well, my name in the passport is Abdallah Cohen. Can you see what that means? I mean, like.
My father-in-law's official name was Musa, Musa Chacham. So he was
wow,
what a great name! Great name.
That's fantastic.
Right.
That's gonna cause some issues, but
no. When he immigrated to Israel in 1951, he became Moshe, but in Iraq he was Musa.
What part of Iraq was he from?
Baghdad.
Baghdad.
So it's just that it makes me think.
So the one part of Iraq everybody knows.
Right. I just wanted to continue on my point, though. It makes me think: what if everyone including the Palestinians and the Israelis, had the same rights as Samaritans, like now do? Like having an Israeli and a Palestinian passport. Remember, it also means economically we have low prices in the West Bank and high salaries in Israel. Like if everyone had that, I mean, how would that work out? That makes me think, in some ways.
If you have a federation or a confederation, you can have a passport of the confederation or the federation, or have a separate passport of your individual state, or you have a passport of your individual state which is recognized as a passport of the confederation. Like if you're a French citizen, your French passport is an EU passport.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense actually.
Yeah,
that's true. Amir, we were speaking about the Myanmar thing earlier, and you said you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Myanmar's going to hell. They had a military coup.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important to mention on a show like ours. Gershon, we like to focus on Israel, Palestine because we all live here, but we're also, promoting peace all over the world. And one of the places that is just going crazy at the moment is Myanmar, is Burma over there in Asia. And we do actually have a mutual friend of ours over there, since the military coup and the junta over there. And we just want to raise a bit of awareness for what's going on because there's soldiers indiscriminately shooting at protesters. and the situation is really, really, really not good over there. Just from your experience, of conflicts, how do you see this one going, and how can we help the Burmese people?
Well, I think that we as Israelis have an obligation to first ask a question. What are the weapons being used to kill the people in Myanmar? And I know that the Israeli military industries have been selling weapons to the Myanmar government and army for years. Israel basically sells weapons to anyone who will buy it. Israel has been known to sell weapons to more than one side in a given conflict. And this is something that we need to ask ourselves as Israelis. What's happening with our own military industries, and who are we selling weapons to, and for what purposes?
Fully agreed.
I think that the situation in Myanmar will have to be resolved at an international level. Israel's not really a player there. It has to be done by the superpowers. It has to be done through the United Nations auspices or other local regional powers. And of course, a military coup. But it didn't just start with a military coup. It started with a genocide there.
Against the
Jews stand up against genocide wherever it takes place.
Horrific. Yeah, I agree fully. What happened to the
that's been going on for a few years. I was actually, my wife and I and another couple, we often do these exotic trips every couple of years. We go to someplace, and we were considering going to Myanmar. This was maybe 2 years ago. And I started reading about the abuses of human rights in Myanmar and said, no, I'm not going there. It's a beautiful country, and I would love to travel there. I have a friend who was actually the Israeli ambassador there. And I sat with them. They gave me all these tips of what I should do and travel and see. But when I read about what the Myanmar government was doing, I said, this is not a country I will go to and support.
Bravo.
Yeah. I guess that's a fair stance, but I don't know. I don't know how to feel about the issue of saying I disagree with the government, so I'm not going to go to a place, or like what the governing authority is going to do, because at the end of the day, like, you going to a place as a tourist and spending your money there, that money helps out the average person way more than it helps the government. Because you go to a tourist in a country, you go to a tea shop and you give that tea shop your business or whatever. Like, that person, like, they do pay taxes to the government. They have to, but you can't really punish them for that. It's a weird idea because, like, I think
you have a definite point, and there's truth to it. And I visited, I was invited to a conference in Malaysia years ago, in 2005, I think. And we were a group of actually 5 Israelis who were part of a delegation that went to a conference about peace in Palestine. That was the name of the conference. And we made a point of staying extra days, and we met with the heads of the opposition to the Malaysian government at the time. They got really pissed at us, and they tried to prevent us from doing it. And in fact, attached to us a guide who was actually a security person who was
a minder.
Because he was a Chinese national, and we spent a whole day with him inciting his anger against the way the government treats the Chinese citizens of Malaysia. And by the time we got to the place where we were having our meeting with the head of the opposition, he just threw us out of the car and left us. He didn't stay with us in the meeting as he was supposed to. But no, I think that if we were going to go to Myanmar, we would seek to meet with opposition leaders as well, and try and learn about the situation there, which is definitely different than just going as a tourist.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, Gershon, it's so great talking to you, but unfortunately we're out of time. But before we go, I want to explain that I yelled Jimmy Carter, and then Gershon chimed in, so it looked like I just brought up Jimmy Carter for no reason. I wanted to say Jimmy Carter spoke out against sanctions against Iran because he said it harms the average person more than it harms the government. So I didn't just yell Jimmy Carter like I have a mental issue. I just want to point that out there. But anyway, Gershon, it's lovely to have you. Episode over.
Boom.
All right. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Now I can put my glasses
Gershon,
on
don't
again.
forget next time you come to Mount Gerizim, please do tell. I'll be happy to